Autumn of 1435, Western France. As the oak forests began to shed their leaves and the long years of blood-soaked war temporarily receded, people believed the worst was finally behind them. Church bells rang each morning. Children ran along dirt roads. Gray stone castles continued to rise above the hills, symbols of order and protection in a fractured land. But there was something that never appeared in prayers, never entered the chronicles, and was never spoken aloud. Something that could not be seen, but could be smelled. It was not screams that first inspired fear, not blood, not darkness. What unsettled those living around the castles was the smell. It was not the stench of fresh corpses left on battlefields, an odor 15th century Europe knew all too well. Nor was it the familiar dampness of ancient stone and underground cellars. This was something else entirely, heavy, old, lingering, as if it did not merely exist in the air, but had soaked into the stone walls, the wooden beams, the narrow cracks, where light never reached. The scent of old metal, of candles burned too long, of dried sweat. And beneath it all, something harder to name, a hidden note of concealed decay. The first to notice were not nobles or clergy, but villagers. Farmers who worked the fields below the hill lived their entire lives in the shadow of power. They were accustomed to lowering their heads, accustomed to not asking questions, accustomed to silence. But smell does not respect a social order. It rode the wind down into the valley, slipped into low-roofed homes, and lingered. At first, people reassured themselves. Every castle has its odors: old stone, wine cellars, salted meat stores, sewers. All of it could be explained. But this smell was inconsistent. Some days, it nearly vanished as if it had never existed. Then on cold mornings, when the air stood still, it returned heavier, more distinct enough to make people stop mid-task and wonder whether they were imagining it. Then the children did not come back. At first, just one. A boy was last seen near the road leading uphill. Then another. A girl promised food and work. No one remembered the first name clearly, because in poor lands, memory is not written in ink, but in pain. People told themselves the children had wandered into the forest or been taken elsewhere. Europe was accustomed to children disappearing because of war and hunger, but the number began to grow, and the smell in the wind did not fade. Some nights the castle gates closed later than usual. Some mornings, supply carts left before dawn, wheels carving deep tracks into dew-soaked earth. No one knew what they carried. No one dared ask. In this era, curiosity could cost a life. The castle remained silent, imposing. Its owner was no nameless figure, but a man spoken of with reverence, in church praised on the battlefield, regarded as a symbol of order after years of chaos, a man who by all reason could not be associated with evil. And that was what made the smell more terrifying. If it had come from a bandit or a despised lord, fear would have a name and a direction. But this odor came from a place of trust, from a place believed to be safe, from a place where people assumed the light of God, and the authority of men had done their duty. The servants within the castle lived closest to that smell. They walked the long corridors, replaced candles, scrubbed stone floors, and learned to breathe shallowly. They did not linger on the doors that were always locked. Some left claiming illness or family matters. Others stayed because in this world, poverty outside the walls could be more frightening than unnamed things within them. History rarely records days like these. It favors moments of eruption, battles, trials, deaths. But before all of that, there is always a more dangerous stage when evil has not yet fully revealed itself, when it exists only as a vague signal, unsettling enough to disturb, but not enough to force action. The smell in the castle was that signal. It did not merely announce crime, it announced silence. As long as the stone walls stood, as long as the Lord's name remained honored, the truth could wait. Some lives were considered too small to disturb power, and so the castle remained quiet. The doors stayed closed. The smell remained. It lingered long enough to become part of the place itself, as if the stone had learned how to keep secrets. Within that silence, something continued to happen, slowly, methodically, without chaos. Not a sudden madness, but the steady breathing of something long accustomed to never being stopped. If you stood at the foot of the hill on a windless afternoon, you would hear no screams carried down, only a faint trace in the air, just enough to make you wonder whether you were imagining it. And if you turned away telling yourself you had thought too much, the castle would continue to keep its secret for a little while longer. At first, no one realized that something was happening. In 15th century Western France, children going missing was not unusual. War had just swept through the land like a storm. Hunger, disease, and deep forests were constant threats. When a child failed to return home by dusk, people chose the simplest explanation because the other explanations were too terrible to accept. A boy was last seen near the edge of the forest. People said he must have lost his way. A girl vanished after leaving the village early one morning. Whispers followed that perhaps she had found work somewhere. These explanations were repeated not because they were convincing, but because people needed them in order to keep living. But then absence began to take shape. Small, empty chairs around the dinner table. Children's shoes are lying untouched in the corner gathering dust. Names no longer called when the sun went down. In poor households where every member was essential to survival, the disappearance of a child was not merely a loss. It was a tear in the fabric of life itself. Mothers began waking in the middle of the night, hearts racing, certain they had heard a familiar voice calling out. Fathers left for the fields before sunrise and returned only after darkness had settled, simply to avoid a home that had become unbearably quiet. No one cried out loudly. Here, public grief brought no answers. Only attention, and attention in this era was dangerous. Then other families lost children as well. It was no longer a single misfortune, no longer an unfortunate coincidence. Children vanished from different villages, different families, but with one shared detail: they disappeared cleanly. No bodies, no torn clothing, no signs of wild animals, as if someone had gently lifted them out of the world, leaving no trace behind. It was that cleanliness that terrified people most. In a world accustomed to brutal visible death, a disappearance without evidence was unnatural. People began to piece together fragments they had previously forced themselves to ignore. Strangers passing through villages, dressed better than the locals, soft-spoken voices, polite manners, promises of food, of work, of a better life beyond the stone walls on the hill. There were no threats, no public violence, only kindness offered in the wrong place, and children by their nature followed. Some left with excitement, others left because their parents had no other choice. In lands eroded by poverty, a warm promise could feel more reliable than a vague fear. No one believed their child would return. No one imagined that the road leading up to the castle could be a one-way path. But time passed and no child ever came back. Fear began to change. It was no longer the distant fear of forests or faraway wars. It became close, specific. Every sound of hooves in the distance. Every wagon wheel is grinding along the dirt road. Every child is running too far beyond sight. Doors closed earlier. Warnings became harsher. But all of it came too late. The most terrifying thing was not death. The most terrifying thing was not knowing. There were no bodies to bury, no rituals to bring an ending, no place to set grief down. These families were trapped in a suspended state, where hope and despair merged, where every passing day became a quiet torture. They could not live as those who still hoped, yet they could not mourn as those who had truly lost. Meanwhile, the castle on the hill remained still. There were no announcements, no explanations, no sign that anything inside had changed. The thick stone walls continued to hide whatever lay behind them, and the smell, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, still drifted down, with the wind, a reminder no one wanted to acknowledge. A few people began to whisper that perhaps they had been wrong to trust. But whispers were all they dared. To speak louder required power. And here power did not belong to those who had lost children. The children who did not return did not shake the castle. They did not alter the order of things. They left only small absences in poor homes, absences that history rarely records. Yet those absences were accumulating slowly, like hairline fractures spreading through a wall, once believed unbreakable. One crack can be ignored, but too many cracks cannot. And although no one yet dared to name it, a terrifying thought was taking shape in more minds than ever before. If these children had not died by accident, if they had not been lost to the forest, if they had not run away, then who had taken them, and why? The question had no answer. But once it existed, silence, no matter how thick, could not protect evil forever. As fear grew, people instinctively searched for a place to set it down. A name, a face, someone they could whisper about and say it was him. But in this land, at this moment in time, there was a cold truth everyone understood, even if no one spoke it aloud. Some people simply could not be suspected. The castle on the hill did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to a man whose name was spoken with reverence in church, with pride in stories of war, and with gratitude in prayers for peace. He was not darkness hiding in the forest. He was standing in the town square, a hero of the age that had just emerged from war, a symbol of order after chaos, a man whose power seemed necessary to keep the world from collapsing once more. People knew him, or at least they believed they did. His name was carved into stone, read aloud in official records, spoken at noble banquets, and woven into sermons by the clergy. It was a name associated with military triumph, deep piety, and generosity toward both church and crown. A man like that, by the logic of the age, could not possibly be the source of the filth and terror that lingered in the air. And it was precisely that logic that protected him. When children vanished, no one spoke of the castle. When the strange smell drifted down into the valley, no one lingered too long looking up the hill. Not because they felt no fear, but because that fear had nowhere to belong. To question a man like this was to question the very order their lives depended on. An order, no matter how cruel, felt safer than chaos. Some whispers died in the throats of those who tried to voice them. There were glances cast toward the hill and quickly turned away, as if even a thought might be discovered. Here, suspicion was not an intellectual act. It was an act of rebellion. And rebellion in a world freshly scarred by war was something no one dared attempt again. The servants within the castle knew more than anyone else, and for that very reason, they were the most silent. They saw the doors that never opened. They heard sounds echoing from corridors no longer in use. They sensed the smell more clearly than anyone because they lived within it every day. But they understood another truth as well. Leaving the castle did not mean safety. Leaving meant poverty, wandering, and existing without anyone's protection. In a place like this, power was not merely strength. It was an atmosphere. It determined what could be spoken and what had to be swallowed back down. Those who lost children had no voice. Those who suspected had no proof. And those who had proof had no power. The man in the castle understood this perfectly. He did not need to issue public threats. He did not need to command silence. Silence was already built into the structure of this society. All he had to do was continue playing. The role everyone expected: protector, devout, believer, exemplary nobleman. Each public appearance, each kneeling, prayer in church, each word of praise for his glorious past reinforced another invisible layer of armor. And behind that armor, the unspeakable continued to exist. What makes this story horrifying is not the idea that a powerful man could commit evil. History is well acquainted with that. What is truly disturbing is how an entire community, whether reluctantly or unconsciously, became complicit in protecting that evil. No one signed an agreement. No one openly consented. But each time they looked away, each time they chose silence, each time they told themselves, it can't be true, they added another stone to the wall, concealing the truth. The children who did not return were not evidence strong enough to break that wall. They were too small, too poor, too anonymous. In the balance of power of this age, their lives did not weigh as much as the reputation of a hero. And so the man in the castle remained someone who could not be suspected, at least for now. But history has a cruel habit. It allows evil to exist long enough to grow confident. And when evil believes itself completely safe, it often makes mistakes. Not because it changes, but because it forgets that power, no matter how great, always depends on something fragile, the silence of others. That silence was beginning to tremble almost imperceptibly. Not yet a voice, not yet an accusation. Only glances held a moment longer. Questions cut off halfway through. Thoughts no longer dismissed as easily as before. The man who could not be suspected was still protected, but the wall around him, no matter how thick, had begun to show its first cracks, small, quiet, and extremely dangerous. To understand why the man in the castle could not be suspected, one cannot look only at what was happening in this quiet valley. One must look backward beyond the forests and dirt roads to a time when blood flowed openly and violence was not hidden but celebrated. The war had just ended, or more precisely, it had merely paused. For years, Western France had been part of a larger seismic rupture, tearing Europe apart. Armies marched through villages, fields were trampled, homes were burned to the ground, bodies were left unburied. In that world, violence was not an exception. It was the common language, and those who spoke it best were given more honorable names: knights, commanders, heroes. The man in the castle was shaped by that world. He learned how to kill before he learned how to govern. He learned how to command and advance before he learned how to remain silent. On the battlefield, no one asked why someone had to die. It was enough to know that death served a greater purpose. When the sword fell, when blood soaked into the earth, it was not considered a crime, but a duty. And duty repeated long enough becomes faith. War not only teaches people how to kill, it teaches them how to feel nothing. Acts that would be called barbaric in times of peace were wrapped in sacred justification during war. Burning villages to secure territory, hanging men to maintain order, torture to extract information. Everything had a reason. Everything was blessed by authority, by the church, by the crown. And when violence is blessed, it ceases to be called violence. It becomes justice. The man in the castle had been immersed in that justice for years. He was rewarded not for compassion, but for efficiency. Not for restraint, but for his ability to inspire fear. Every victory, every enemy corpse, every village brought to heel became another stone in the foundation of his reputation. That reputation was not built despite violence, but through it. And because of that, violence never felt wrong to him. It merely needed to be placed in the proper context. When the war ended, the world around him changed, but people do not change that quickly. The sword was returned to its sheath. The armor was hung on the wall, but the lessons of the battlefield remained embedded deep in the way the world was understood. In a society struggling to restore order, men like him were seen as necessary. They were the ones who had done the dirty work, so others could live in peace. And because of that, they were forgiven even before any question was asked. This was the most dangerous moment, because once violence has been considered sacred, it becomes very difficult to accept that the same hands in times of peace might commit evil. People prefer to believe that war is a sealed box, that what happens within it does not leak out. But war is not a place. It is a state of mind, and that state does not disappear simply because the horns stop sounding. Inside the castle on the hill, violence was no longer displayed before thousands of witnesses. It no longer took the shape of battle or marching armies. It became private, quieter, more orderly, but its essence did not change. It was still the power to decide life and death, still the sensation of absolute control, still the belief that some lives exist to serve a higher purpose. And if on the battlefield that purpose was victory, then here in times of peace, that purpose began to grow vague and far more dangerous. What prevented the surrounding community from recognizing this transformation was their long habit of worshiping those who delivered violence. They had learned to bow to men who had killed in their name. They had been taught that certain acts exist beyond ordinary morality, as long as the person committing them carried the right title. And so when strange things began to happen around the castle, no one thought of war as the cause. No one connected the years of bloodshed to the terrifying silence of the present. They saw only a hero returned home, a protector resting after too many sacrifices, a man whose past was too glorious to be stained by small inconvenient doubts. But history is rarely that kind. Again and again, it shows that societies that glorify violence eventually pay for that reverence. Not immediately, not publicly, but slowly, quietly in the shadows where light does not reach. When violence is no longer named as violence, it finds other forms in which to survive. And inside the castle, on the hill, the lessons of war are still being applied, only no one called them by their old name anymore. The man who could not be suspected did not need to change. The world around him had changed enough to protect him. Because when a society has grown accustomed to calling violence sacred, it struggles deeply to admit that the sacred thing has rotted from the inside. And while the villagers continued trying to live with the empty spaces in their homes, up on the hill behind thick stone walls, the familiar logic of the battlefield kept operating cold, orderly, and completely without any sense that it needed to apologize. There was a moment in history when violence no longer needed to hide in the shadows. It stepped into the light, was praised sanctified, and treated as an act of faith. That moment did not take place inside a castle, but in a public square where every eye was fixed on the same rising flame. The man in the castle once stood there. The crowd pressed together in the cold. Prayers blended with murmurs, with the smell of smoke beginning to rise from stacked dry wood. At the center of the square stood a young woman. Her hands bound her body thin, yet her face disturbingly calm. They called her a heretic, a witch, one who whispered with the devil. But before she was given those names, she was simply someone who had spoken things she was not supposed to say and believed things she was not allowed to believe. The fire was lit amid chanting prayers. Those with power stood at the front, clergy, officials, and men long accustomed to killing on the battlefield. No one considered this a murder. They called it purification, a necessary ritual to protect order, to keep the world from slipping from God's grasp. When the flames climbed her body, when the first scream tore through the cold air, no one turned away. To turn away was to doubt, and doubt in this age was a sin. The man in the castle learned an important lesson that day. He saw how faith could turn suffering into duty, how a community could kill a human being together and still believe they were doing what was right. He saw the strange calm that settled over the faces of these present after it was over, as if a hidden burden had been lifted, not because they pitied the girl, but because they had completed what was deemed a necessary ritual. The fire not only burns a body, it burned away the final boundary between violence and morality. When a person can be killed before hundreds of witnesses and called justice, then from that moment on, every limit becomes flexible. What matters is no longer the act itself, but the story told around it. If the story is convincing enough, sacred enough, necessary enough, then anything can be accepted. The man in the castle carried that lesson home with him. In war, violence is shielded by the enemy. On the pyre, violence is shielded by God. And when he returned to the castle, violence no longer needed a shield at all. It had been internalized. It became part of the logic of living, a neutral tool usable as long as the one wielding it believed his reason was justified. From that point on, the boundary between crime and ritual grew thin, between pain and necessity, between victim and sacrifice. Within the thick stone walls of the castle, there was no public square, no crowd, no priest reciting prayers. But the atmosphere of that day remained. The idea that some people exist to absorb suffering on behalf of the rest of the world. The belief that pain, if placed in the right context, could become meaningful. This is where faith and violence merged. The man in the castle did not need to think of himself as evil. He had seen good people commit the cruelest acts and be praised for it. He had watched a community kill a vulnerable human being together and call it salvation. After witnessing that inflicting pain in silence behind closed doors was not a great leap, it was simply a continuation of logic. And so when terrible things began to happen inside the castle, they did not appear as a rebellion against morality. They appeared as a private ritual, a quieter, more contained version, but no less sacred than the fire that once burned in the town square. People often believe monsters are born in darkness, but sometimes they are forged in the light of faith amid prayers and holy smoke. When a woman is burned as a saint or a heretic, the world learns how to look away from human suffering. And once the world has learned that lesson, what follows is only a matter of space and silence. The castle on the hill was the perfect space for that silence. After the fire, what remains is not always ash. Sometimes what lingers is far more dangerous emptiness. When war ends, when rituals of faith have fulfilled their purpose, when the roar of the crowd dissolves into cold air, those once celebrated must return to ordinary life. And it is precisely at that moment that history begins to fracture. Glory is not something that can be sustained forever. It burns brightly, then fades, leaving behind a void that not everyone can endure. The man in the castle stepped into that void. He returned not in defeat, but in victory. His reputation was complete, solid beyond question, yet bound to that reputation was a problem no one spoke of. On the battlefield, every day had a purpose. Every morning had an enemy. Every decision carried life or death, and that clarity produced a powerful, almost addictive sensation. When it all ended, the world felt smaller, slower, and meaningless. The castle on the hill was too quiet. Thick stone walls no longer trembled with the clash of steel, only echoed his own footsteps. Long corridors led not to battle or ritual, but to empty rooms. In that silence, there were no external enemies left to confront. And when there are no enemies outside, people often begin searching for them within. The void after glory is not sadness. It is the absence of stimulation, the feeling that the world is no longer large enough to contain who you are. For someone accustomed to absolute power, to commanding and being obeyed, normality becomes a subtle form of humiliation. Each day without a challenge feels like a waste, and the void begins to demand to be filled. At first, it is filled with memory, recollections of battle, of screams of the sensation of holding life and death in one's hands. But memory, no matter how vivid, fades. Then comes repetition of old rituals, discipline, order, punishment. Practices that once held meaning on the battlefield are now imposed within the castle, not because they are necessary, but because they are familiar. In a world without war, the man in the castle began to create smaller versions of it. No one named it. It was not written down. It was not acknowledged. But small commands grew harsher. Minor mistakes were punished more severely. Moral boundaries, already blurred by war, nearly vanished altogether. When power meets no resistance, it does not stop. It tests its own limits. The void after glory does not scream. It whispers. It says that everything that came before was not enough, that sacrifices, deaths, and sacred rituals must lead to something greater. And if the world does not provide that meaning, then the one with power will create it himself. Not out of hatred, not out of pleasure, at least not at first, but out of the need to feel relevant, to feel necessary, to feel that he still commands the fate of others. Inside the castle, voids began to appear everywhere, not only in the mind of its ruler, but in the structure of life itself. Rooms are rarely entered, areas no longer questioned. People are becoming invisible, while the world outside adjusted to the slow rhythm of peace behind stone walls. A different rhythm was forming, quiet, deliberate, and far more frightening. The void required targets. It needed somewhere to be poured out. And in every society, the weakest are always the easiest choice. Not because they are special, but because their disappearance makes no noise. They do not leave behind gaps large enough to cause alarm. They are simply swallowed by a system, accustomed to not seeing them. The man in the castle did not need to change who he was to step onto this path. He only needed to remain himself in a world that had changed. The war had ended, but the habits of war had not. Faith had completed its public role, but the logic of sacrifice remained waiting to be applied in silence. The void after glory is not immediate collapse. It is the most dangerous phase when no one is watching, when there is no crowd's light or public flame. Only thick walls prolong silence, and a power searching for new meaning within itself. And within that silence, what was once only a possibility began to turn into a habit. In every old castle, there are doors that lead nowhere. They sit at the ends of corridors beyond seldom used turns, made of the same wood, fitted with the same iron handles as every other door, yet they are never opened. Not because they are locked, but because no one is permitted to be curious. The castle on the hill was no different. At first, those doors drew little attention. They were simply part of the architecture remnants of earlier generations, old rooms with no clear function anymore. But over time, as life inside the castle began to change, as the void after glory started to be filled with new habits, the presence of those doors grew heavier. The man in the castle knew exactly which doors were not meant to be opened. No prohibition was ever spoken aloud. No signs were posted. There was only an unspoken understanding that spread through silence. Servants learned quickly, not through words, but through the way a gaze lingered too long, through the subtle shift in the master's voice, when someone stood too close by accident. Here, curiosity was not punished publicly. It was extinguished before it could fully form. The unopened doors created an invisible map of fear. Each day, people passed by them, keys resting in their pockets, never once considering the act of trying. Not because they could not, but because they did not want to know what would happen if they did. In a world that had learned to survive through silence, knowledge itself became a dangerous burden. To know too much was to lose the possibility of return. Space itself began to remember. The corridors leading to those doors felt colder. Sound behaved differently there, swallowed by stone and shadow. Torchlight never fully reached the far edges, leaving fixed pockets of darkness, as if the castle itself were attempting to conceal something. People quickened their steps, not out of explicit fear, but because of a sensation difficult to name, an instinct warning them not to linger. The man in the castle spent more time in those areas, not openly, not according to any visible schedule, but his absences developed a rhythm. There were moments in the day when no one knew where he was, and no one dared to ask. His absence caused no alarm. It was accepted as part of the new order, much like bad weather or the long nights of winter. Gradually, the unopened doors ceased to be exceptions. They became the center of a system of silence. New arrivals to the castle quickly learned that certain questions were never to be asked. Certain areas were never to be mentioned, and certain people, once they crossed an unseen threshold, would not return to their former place in daily life. No one said they disappeared. They were simply no longer seen. The most terrifying thing was not the disappearance itself, but how easily it was absorbed into routine. Meals continued on schedule. Work was assigned as usual. Social rituals remained intact. The castle functioned like an old but efficient machine, and within that machine, the unopened doors acted like hidden gears, unnecessary to understand for the system to continue operating smoothly. The man in the castle did not need to oversee everything. He had created an environment where fear regulated behavior on its own. When people do not know what lies beyond a door, their imagination completes the task, and imagination, when cultivated in silence, is often more cruel than reality. Those doors did not need to be opened to serve their purpose. They existed as a constant reminder that power does not reside only in what is visible, but in what is concealed. The most effective form of control is the kind that causes the controlled to impose limits upon themselves. In the castle, no one was forced to avoid those doors. They did so willingly, and over time, even the concept of opening them disappeared. The unopened doors became part of the mental landscape. They were no longer seen as entrances, but as walls. No one remembered where they led. No one was certain what lay behind them. All that remained was a silent agreement that it was better to leave them untouched. The void after glory, once confined to the mind of a single man, had now spread into physical space. It had shape, location, and even a schedule. It became part of the daily life, accepted without explanation. From the outside, people still looked up at the castle as a symbol of power and order. But inside that order was maintained by unopened doors, unasked questions, and a shared understanding that some things were better left forever in the dark. And within that acceptance, darkness found its ideal home. The unopened doors could only exist because people were willing to walk past them every day without stopping. No one blindfolded them. No one forced them to turn away. What happened was far more subtle. They learned how not to see. At first, it was a natural reflex. In a space where power was always present, but never named, avoiding one's gaze became a survival instinct. People lowered their heads slightly when passing through the cold corridors. They walked faster, kept their hands busy, kept their thoughts focused on small, harmless tasks, not because they believed nothing was wrong, but because they understood that recognizing what was wrong could be more dangerous than the wrongdoing itself. Gradually, the reflex became a habit. Strange sounds were no longer mentioned. Absences were no longer questioned. Language shifted before awareness could catch up. Instead of saying someone disappeared, people said they had been transferred elsewhere. Instead of admitting fear, they called it respect. These new words did not just soothe consciences, they created a more livable reality. Inside the castle, no one considered themselves a bad person. Everyone had a reasonable justification for their silence. Servants needed to keep their jobs. Overseers needed to preserve order. Families needed to stay safe. No one believed their individual choices could alter something larger, and that belief is precisely what made the larger structure immovable. The man in the castle did not need to command this blindness. It formed on its own a chain reaction of fear and adaptation. When a community lives in darkness long enough, it adjusts its vision accordingly. The line between light and shadow fades. Everything becomes a safe shade of gray. The most terrifying part was not that people did not know. It was that they knew just enough to avoid knowing more. There were brief moments, fleeting, fragile, when the truth nearly surfaced. A gaze held for too long. A sentence cut off halfway. A door is closing a second too slowly. In those moments, fear appeared clearly sharp as a blade. But it was quickly wrapped in reason. Not here, not now, not my concern. And then the moment passed. Those living in the castle began to measure their safety, not by truth, but by distance. As long as they did not step too close, as long as they did not ask the wrong questions, as long as they stayed within permitted boundaries, the world continued to function. Meals were served on time. Orders were carried out. Social rituals were maintained with flawless appearance. Violence in such an environment did not need to appear often. It only needed to exist as a constant possibility. A possibility never spoken aloud, but felt by everyone. And when violence becomes an assumed presence, people adjust their behavior to avoid triggering it. This was not loud complicity. It was silent complicity. The man in the castle understood the value of this silence perfectly. Every unanswered question, every averted gaze, every failure to connect the pieces strengthened his power just a little more, not because he forced it, but because the system had learned to function without force. Those who learned not to see did not feel like traitors. They felt adaptive. And in an unstable world, adaptation is considered a virtue. It helps people survive, but it carries a very specific cost-moral numbness. When a community accepts that some things are better left unknown, it also accepts that some people do not need to be seen. The weakest become shadows. Their existence thins to the point where the disappearance creates no disturbance large enough to break routine. Inside the castle, evil did not need to be carefully hidden. It only needed to be familiar enough to stop shocking, repeated enough to become part of the mental landscape. When the abnormal persists long enough, It becomes normal. And once it is normal, no one feels compelled to react. Those who learn not to see eventually forget that they ever saw at all. They no longer remember the original unease, no longer remember when questions were still whispered. The castle with its unopened doors and cold corridors becomes the only world they know, a world where safety is purchased with silence, and silence is maintained by turning away. And in that world, the man in a castle does not need to be an obvious monster. He only needs to exist surrounded by people who have learned not to see what is happening directly in front of them. But history shows that collective blindness never lasts forever. It only requires one small disruption, one deviation, outside habit to begin collapsing. When that happens, those who have lived longest in darkness are often the most blinded when the light finally arrives. And when that light comes, it is rarely gentle. Not all children disappeared, only some. And that was precisely what made it dangerous. In the valley below the hill, children still ran along dirt roads, still helped their families in the fields, still laughed before nightfall. Life viewed from a distance did not appear broken, but looked at more closely, a selection was quietly taking place. It was never written down, never announced. Yet it was clear to the one carrying it out. The man in the castle did not take it at random. He did not need numbers. He needed suitability. The children who were chosen shared unsettling similarities. They came from families without voices, too poor to complain, too isolated to form a wave, too accustomed to being overlooked for their absence to cause immediate shock. They were often obedient children. Obedient in the sense of being non-disruptive, not asking questions, knowing how to lower their heads before adults. In a society that taught children silence meant safety, these children learned the lesson too well, and that obedience made them ideal targets. The selection did not happen in a single moment. It was the result of prolonged observation. Walks through villages, passing glances, seemingly harmless questions about family circumstances, about parents, about who would notice if a child did not return home on time. The man in the castle did not need to hurry. He had time power and an environment that had already learned not to see. Once the choice was made, the rest happened quickly. There were no chases, no screams echoing across fields. Everything occurred within the gaps the community had grown used to ignoring. A child was assigned a small task, a modest promise, a command that could not be refused when it came from someone feared by the entire region. The child crossed a boundary it did not understand, and that was enough. The most frightening part was not the final act, but the preparation that preceded it. The man in the castle did not see these children as full human beings. He saw them as the continuation of a familiar logic, the weak serving a stronger order. On the battlefield, it was young soldiers. On the pyre, those labeled heretics. In the castle, it was children. The context changed. The targets changed. The structure of power did not. And because that structure had long been accepted by society, no one noticed the moment it crossed its final boundary. Families who lost children began with confusion. Perhaps the child took the wrong road. Perhaps they stayed overnight somewhere. In the first days, hope still existed, fragile, but enough to delay fear. But as time passed, hope turned into a question no one wanted to answer. And once spoken, that question was quickly suffocated by reality. They knew what they were facing, and they also knew they had no means to confront it. The man in the castle understood this better than anyone. He did not need to hide carefully because the imbalance of power did that work for him. The missing children were not incidents requiring investigation. They were acceptable deviations in a system accustomed to sacrificing the weak to preserve stability. And then the most dangerous thing happened. Selection became a habit. It was no longer a singular decision, no longer a rare moment. It had rhythm, timing, repetition, sufficient to create a sense of control. The man in the castle no longer needed to search each time. The environment provided everything in advance. Vulnerable families, easily guided children. Roads are seldom traveled. Everything was already there, waiting to be used. In the eyes of the community, There was no child killer, only a series of separate tragedies unconnected to one another. And that perception was the perfect camouflage. When evil is fragmented long enough, it stops being recognized as evil at all. Those who were chosen were not named. They were not remembered. They had no graves to mark their absence. Their existence was erased piece by piece, not through public violence, but through systematic indifference. The man in the castle did not need to think of himself as a monster. He only needed to believe he was operating within an order that had existed for generations, an order where not every life carried the same weight, an order where the children of the voiceless could be taken without shaking the foundations of society. But every system, no matter how sealed, carries the seed of its own collapse. Selection, once habitual, leaves traces, not immediately, not where one expects to find them, but enough that one day, when someone is forced to look directly, all the pieces will suddenly lock into place. And when that happens, the story will no longer be about individual children who disappeared. It will be about a single man who chose them again and again in the silence that an entire world helped maintain. When selection becomes habit, the next step is inevitable normalization. What was once a personal, discrete, and rare decision begins to take the shape of a ritual. Not a ritual written down or sworn to, but one repeated often enough that it no longer requires conscious thought. Inside the castle, time no longer moves as it does outside. It is broken into familiar pockets of quiet, into moments when doors close, into hours when no one asks where the man in the castle has gone. Violence, once it finds its rhythm, no longer needs emotion to function. It needs order. Everything begins with separation. The children are removed from their familiar world, not through panic, but through compliance. They have been taught that certain commands cannot be refused, especially when they come from the place where power is concentrated. No explanation is required. No threat is necessary. The imbalance of power has done that work long ago. The man in the castle does not do this alone, not because he needs assistance, but because every system requires links. Some roles are very small, opening a passage, remaining silent, turning away at the right moment. No one involved has seen the entire picture, and that is the point. When each person holds only a fragment, no one feels they are participating in something unforgivable. The ritual does not need words. It is carried out through habit, through unchanging routes, through rooms accustomed to dampness and cold stone. Space itself becomes memory. With each repetition, the walls remember better than people do. They know when to absorb sound, when to conceal. They keep secrets more faithfully than any oath. The man in a castle conducts the ritual with terrifying calm. There are no sudden outbursts of rage, no chaos, only a cold sense of control, like a battlefield once everything has fallen into formation. This is not a moment of immediate pleasure. It is a moment of pure power where a person believes himself to exist beyond ordinary moral constraints. What allows the ritual to endure is not cruelty, but consistency. Each time it occurs, it reinforces a dangerous belief that the world continues to function normally afterward. The sun still rises, work is completed, the castle remains quiet. There is no obvious sign that a boundary has been crossed, and that normalcy is the most perfect disguise of all. The children do not disappear all at once. They vanish, sporadically spaced far enough apart to avoid collective shock. The ritual understands this. It is designed to blend into the rhythm of the community, leaving the surface undisturbed. Each repetition tests the limits of silence, and each time silence proves it can endure a little more. In the mind of the man in the castle, the ritual carries no personal meaning. It carries a function. On the battlefield, function was victory. In faith, function was purification. In the castle, function is the maintenance of control. In a world that has grown too small for an ego shaped by past glory. Once violence is assigned a function, it no longer requires emotional justification, and so the ritual continues. It does not escalate immediately. It refines. It learns. It removes small errors. With each repetition, it becomes cleaner, quieter, more efficient. Risks are reduced. Paths are selected. Timing is calculated. This is not randomness. This is a system maturing. The most disturbing thing is that no one inside the castle sees the ritual as a sequence of crimes. They see it as part of an unnamed order, something that exists at the edge of awareness where questions are best left unasked. And when no one asks questions, the ritual does not need to hide excessively. But every ritual leaves residue, not where it is easily seen, not as obvious physical evidence, but as subtle shifts in behavior, in glances, in the way people avoid certain areas. Those minimally involved begin to sleep less soundly. Those who witness from a distance speak less. The castle still stands, but the air inside grows thicker, heavier with each passing week. A ritual in darkness does not need an audience. It needs repetition. And that repetition is what will ultimately betray it. Because when an act is performed often enough, it stops being an exception. It becomes a pattern. And patterns, no matter how carefully concealed, leave traces for those who are forced to look directly. The man in the castle believes the ritual has been perfected, that it is discreet enough to exist forever behind unopened doors and averted gazes. But history shows that no ritual survives indefinitely in darkness, not because morality suddenly awakens, but because no human action can be repeated endlessly without deviation. And when that deviation appears, it will give no warning. No system collapses because of a single powerful blow at the beginning. It collapses because of a small detail out of place, appearing at a moment when it is not permitted to exist. Inside the castle, deviation began quietly, so quietly that no one noticed at first. A familiar rhythm slipped half a step. A habit occurred later than usual. A door that should have closed completely lingered open for a fraction of a moment. In the outside world, such things would mean nothing. But in a ritual built on perfect repetition, they were dangerous signs. The man in the castle sensed it before anyone else. He did not name it deviation. He called it the carelessness of others, a weak link, an individual lacking the discipline required to maintain order. In a mindset forged by war and authority, error is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to tighten control. But tightening control always has a cost. More control means more eyes, more commands, more people drawn in, even if only at the edges. And every new person pulled into the system carries something unpredictable, human reaction. Not everyone learns not to see at the same pace. Not everyone remains silent in the same way. This deviation did not come from rebellion. It came from something very simple, very human. A child cried louder than expected, not from pain, but from fear. The sound did not last long. It was quickly suppressed, but it echoed in the wrong place, traveled down a corridor rarely used, and reached the ears of someone who did not belong to the ritual. Just one person, just one moment. But it was enough. That person did not understand what was happening. And because they did not understand, they could not immediately dismiss it the way others did. Those accustomed to the ritual automatically filed the sound away, not my concern. But to someone untrained by silence, the sound became a question. And once a question exists, it does not disappear easily. The man in the castle sensed the shift in the air faster than any rumor. He noticed hesitation in a few glances, slight delays in obedience, silences that no longer felt the same. None of this was enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to fracture the feeling of absolute power. And when absolute power cracks, the response is often extreme. The ritual did not stop, it accelerated. The man in the castle believed speed was the best way to push through instability. Less time to think, fewer gaps for questions to form, but that urgency created more deviations. Preparations were skipped, familiar routes were altered. Decisions once carefully weighed were now made under strain. A second deviation appeared. This time it was not sound. It was an absence at the wrong moment. Someone who should have been present was not. A minor task left undone. A detail seemingly harmless, but when placed within the larger picture, it opened a gap. And that gap, however small, was enough to let light in. No one inside the castle immediately saw the full truth, but a few began to see parts of it. And once people see even a fragment of evil, they cannot return to complete unawareness. They begin connecting what was once kept separate: missing children, avoided areas, unexplained commands. Each fragment alone was still insufficient, but together they formed a disturbing shape. The man in the castle recognized this, and he responded most familiarly by sowing fear. Warnings were issued, indirect, but clear enough for everyone to understand the consequences of seeing too much. The order was emphasized. Loyalty was reaffirmed. Past glory was raised like a shield. For a short time, the strategy worked. Some gazes lowered again. Some questions were swallowed back. But not all of them. Deviation had occurred, and once it exists, it cannot be erased. It remains like a hairline crack in a foundation, silently widening each time the system comes under pressure. Every ritual that followed no longer moved as smoothly as before. The sense of absolute safety was gone. There was always a brief moment when the man in the castle wondered whether this time he had gone too far. That question did not make him stop, but it made him err. History does not change because evil suddenly grows a conscience. It changes because evil, once forced into a defensive posture, begins to make mistakes that absolute power once allowed it to avoid. Deviation within the ritual was not the end. It was the beginning of a chain of events no one inside the castle could fully control anymore. Beyond the unopened doors, the world continued as before, but somewhere deep within the structure, once thought unbreakable, something had shifted. No one named it, but everyone felt it. Evil was no longer perfect. And once perfection is broken, concealment becomes only a matter of time. After the first deviation, the castle was no longer the same, even though its outward appearance had not changed at all. The corridors were still long and cold. The doors are still closed tight. Orders were still delivered in the same familiar tone. But something had shifted very slightly, very deeply, and irreversibly. No one announced it. There was no marked moment. The change began with details too small to name, yet clear enough to unsettle. Certain areas of the castle were suddenly no longer used as often. Some passageways were avoided without explanation. People who once passed through them daily now chose longer routes, slower, farther, but safer. At first, everything could be explained with harmless reasons. Work routines shifted, the order was adjusted, new priorities emerged. But when these small changes began repeating, they ceased to be accidental. They formed a pattern, and that pattern belonged to no one's original plan. Tasks once assigned routinely now carry weight, not because they were more difficult, but because they required entering spaces that had previously existed only in rumor. No one explained what happened there, but those who entered often returned with an unusual silence. Not the silence of discipline, but the silence of awareness. Awareness is the most dangerous element in a system built on denial. Once someone realizes that separate fragments can connect, they no longer see the surrounding world the same way. The missing children are no longer isolated cases. Unexplained orders are no longer harmless habits. Avoided areas are no longer coincidental. Everything begins to carry new weight, even if no one dares to say it aloud. Truth does not arrive as a direct blow. It seeps into space slowly, quietly. Conversations shorten. Avoided glances linger longer. Questions stop halfway through. The castle continues to function, but under new tension, like a structure bearing pressure from within. No one wants to be the first to speak what everyone is beginning to sense, because to speak is to lose the safety of ignorance forever. The man in the castle does not need to issue explicit commands of silence. Silence arrives on its own as a survival reflex, but this time it is no longer intact. It is torn by images that cannot be erased, by sounds that echoed in the wrong place at the wrong time, by tasks too specific to allow continued pretense. Concealment begins to change form. Orders are no longer written down. Some instructions are passed orally shared only with those deemed trustworthy. Familiar routes are adjusted, schedules disrupted. These are not signs of absolute control, but of defense. And defense always signals that something is under threat. No one names the person at the center of it all, but his shadow grows heavier. Every decision, every small alteration in order, bears the mark of the same will. That will no longer move smoothly. It reacts. It adapts. It tries to seal the cracks left by deviation. But the more it repairs, the more visible the seams become. The more it tightens control, the more signs of instability spread. Those who live and work inside the castle do not need to know the full story to understand that something is profoundly wrong. They only need to know where not to go, which questions not to ask, and which absences not to mention. This knowledge is not taught. It is learned quickly by instinct, and then the inevitable happens. Fragments begin assembling themselves in many minds, even though no one dares place them on the table. Truth exists in the space between exchanged glances, extended silences, and swallowed words. It does not need to be spoken to exist. It only needs to be known. This is the moment when concealment loses its absolute power. Not because the secret has been exposed, but because it no longer belongs to a single person. When too many people carry the same suspicion, the same vague but persistent awareness, the system begins to tremble. Not loudly, not violently, but with a low internal strain, like a foundation cracked before collapse is admitted. The monstrous man in the castle senses this, not through reason, but through the instinct of someone accustomed to total control. The silence around him is no longer pure. It contains too much that remains unsaid, and unsaid things are more dangerous than any public accusation. History shows that this is the stage where the most stories are buried, not when crimes are committed, but when they begin to surface through gaps that can no longer be fully sealed. Later records will be vague about this period. Testimonies will lack detail. Archives will contain holes, not because nothing happened, but because too much happened in silence. And it is within that silence that the path toward exposure begins to form, even though no one yet dares to step onto it. History rarely names monsters at the beginning. It tries to avoid them first. It circles around them. It uses vague language to delay the moment of confrontation. But eventually, even silence loses its ability to conceal. In the lands beneath the castle, the stories begin to change in tone. They are no longer only the private grief of families who lost children, no longer vague fears kept behind kitchen doors or whispered in empty fields. The stories begin to touch each other, and when they do, they form something unmistakable. At first, the name is never spoken in full. It appears in sentences cut short, in glances cast around before voices drop, in phrases that begin with "we shouldn't say this" and end in prolonged silence. No one dares pronounce it clearly because everyone understands that naming it means breaking a taboo that has existed for far too long. But even unspoken, the name is present. It emerges whenever avoided areas of the castle are mentioned, whenever a family asks too many questions and is advised to stay quiet, whenever a child disappears in a way disturbingly similar to the ones before. Gradually, no one needs to say the name to know who is being referenced. Recognition completes itself in silence. What makes this moment dangerous is not the appearance of a new truth, but the fact that it no longer belongs to a single person. A name held by one mind can be buried. A name held by many minds begins to live a life of its own. Inside the castle, the response does not come immediately. Power rarely reacts in haste. It observes first. It measures how far the whispers have traveled. It tries to determine whether this suspicion is a dying spark or a potential fire. And in doing so, that very caution grants the name more time to take root. Orders grow more rigid. Punishments are mentioned more often, even when not always enforced. Power becomes more visibly present in spaces that were once quiet. This is not a display of absolute strength, but of fear of intrusion. Outside the castle, the stories continue to spread, but in a very particular way. There are no indictments, no public accusations, only the repetition of the same pattern, moving from village to village, from family to family. When the same story is told with different details, but the same conclusion, it begins to carry the weight of truth. And within those stories, the name slowly comes into focus, not as a clearly described murderer, but as an untouchable center of power, a figure toward whom every path seems to lead, even if no one wishes to admit it. Later history will record this period in ambiguous terms, widespread suspicion, disturbing rumors, unofficial accusations. But for those living through it, ambiguity does not lessen fear. It only makes fear harder to name. The moment the name begins to surface is also the moment the final boundary is touched. Not the moral boundary that was crossed long ago, but the political one. When whispers cease to belong only to the poor and powerless, and begin reaching the ears of those with status concealment, is no longer an internal matter of a single castle. It becomes a threat to a larger order. History is particularly sensitive to moments like this. This is when it begins to intervene, not out of compassion for victims, but out of fear of losing control. A name once shared by many minds at the same time becomes something that must be addressed. But to address does not mean to reveal. In later records, this phase is often the most blurred. Accounts lack detail. Timelines stretch or compress unnaturally. Certain events are noted, but never connected. The name appears, then disappears from documents, as if it never fully existed. This is not negligence. It is intention. History does not want the monstrous man to become too clear a symbol, one that would force society to ask uncomfortable questions about itself. Instead, it tries to keep the name suspended enough to explain certain events, but not enough to collapse the entire structure of power that enabled him. But for those who heard the whispers, the name cannot be erased from memory. Even if it is never fully written, even if it is never spoken aloud, it has claimed a permanent place in collective awareness. And from that moment on, the story is no longer about individual children who disappeared. It becomes a story of a single man, a man history is trying to both acknowledge and conceal at the same time. And that contradiction will leave fractures that cannot be erased from the surviving records. Those fractures are where centuries later, we are forced to look back and ask what truly happened and what was deliberately allowed to be forgotten. Once the name had begun to exist in whispers, history no longer had the option to remain outside. But its intervention did not come in the way the victims might have hoped. History did not arrive to illuminate, it arrived at control. That process always begins with paperwork. Not public indictments, but dry administrative records, lines of text that appear emotionless, dates, locations. Certain events are carefully selected to be entered into the files. Others are omitted entirely, as if they never occurred. This is not oversight. It is a technique. The earliest records do not name crimes. They name issues, a series of disturbances, a concern for order, a threat to the stability of the region. The disappearance of children is mentioned indirectly, if at all, as an unfortunate consequence without a clear cause. Administrative language has the power to blur everything it touches, and in this case, it is applied with precision. The name, when it appears on paper, does not carry its full weight. It is placed within cautious phrasing surrounded by conditions, assumptions, and restraint. Not committed, but suspected. Not crimes, but allegations. Every word is chosen to create distance between truth and responsibility. The record does not deny what happened, but it does not allow truth to step outside the boundaries of control. This is the moment when many historical narratives are most distorted. From this point forward, what is recorded no longer reflects reality, but rather what is permitted to exist within official memory. Details deemed too specific are excluded as unverifiable. Direct testimony is questioned for lack of reliability. Witnesses who do not fit the desired narrative are pushed aside if not erased from the record. A sealed archive is not merely a stack of papers locked away. It is a boundary, an unspoken declaration that from this moment on, the story will be told differently, not by those who lived it, but by those who possess the authority to decide how it will be remembered. The truth does not disappear. It is compressed into a form more acceptable to power. In that form, the monstrous man is no longer central. He becomes an element of a broader context, a symptom of the era, a product of circumstance. Individual responsibility dissolves into abstract concepts, war instability, moral decay. In this way, history simultaneously acknowledges that something profoundly wrong occurred while avoiding the most uncomfortable question of all: who did it and who allowed it to continue. Families who lost children find no consolation in the records. Their children's names rarely appear. If they do, it is only as numbers in incomplete tallies. There is no story, no context, no recognition of grief. The records were not written for them. They were written for those who wanted the matter closed as quickly as possible. And once the files are sealed, something crucial happens. Time begins to do the rest. Those who know the truth grow old. Some die. Others fall silent, not because they forget, but because they understand their memories no longer carry official value. Later generations encounter only the filtered version. The hardest questions do not vanish entirely, but they fade like shapes behind thick glass. History prefers stories with an ending. Sealed records provide that illusion. They allow people to believe the matter has been handled, that order has been restored, that everything necessary has been known. But this sense of closure is artificial. Records do not resolve crimes. They place a lid over them. In official accounts, the monstrous man no longer appears as the source of prolonged terror. He is reduced, blurred, and transformed into an unpleasant but skippable chapter. Not because the truth is less horrific, but because it is too horrific to be preserved intact. What remains is absence, gaps in documentation, gaps between timelines, gaps in testimony. These absences, centuries later, become clues for those willing to look deeper, because history, no matter how carefully constructed, can never be flawless. It always leaves behind traces of haste, fear, and compromise. A sealed archive does not end a story. It only changes how the story can be approached. From this point forward, the monstrous man no longer exists clearly within collective memory. He survives in footnotes, in censored documents, in whispers lingering at the edges of history. And it is precisely this ambiguity that makes confronting him so much harder, because to recover the truth requires not only the courage to face the crime itself, but the courage to question history, what was left out of the record, and why. Once the files are sealed, history does not fall completely silent. It simply changes its voice. What is no longer permitted to exist in official records finds another way to survive. It slips out of administrative language and into folk memory, into stories told by firelight, into whispers passed from one person to another, changing slightly with each retelling. Truth does not disappear. It mutates. At first, memory remains sharp. Those who lived through that time remember clearly. They remember the children who never returned, the roads that were avoided, the fear that could not be named. But personal memory has one great weakness. It is unprotected. As those who carry it age and disappear, what remains is not the intact truth, but fragments. Those fragments begin to be reassembled differently. No longer the story of a specific individual with specific power and specific responsibility. It becomes a story of a violent era, of the darkness of a time, of things that cannot be explained. Collective memory seeks comfort, and comfort comes from blaming vague forces rather than confronting individuals. In this process, the monstrous man slowly loses his true shape. He is no longer a flesh and blood person making decisions, issuing orders, choosing victims. He becomes a shadow, a curse, a frightening tale told to children to keep them obedient. His cruelty is no longer linked to power but to the supernatural. This does not reduce the horror, but it dissolves responsibility, because no one is responsible for a ghost. New stories emerge, each pushing the truth a little farther away. Some claim the children were taken by demons. Others say the castle was cursed. Some transform the monstrous man into a half-human creature, no longer belonging to the world of law or society. These details do not arise by accident. They serve a clear purpose to separate the crime from the society that allowed it to exist. When truth becomes legend, it no longer demands difficult questions. No one has to ask why that power went unchecked. Why do the whispers last so long? Why do the children come from the weakest families? Legend allows people to feel fear without thinking. It lets them say, "That was long ago," without examining the familiar structures that remain. Official history does not resist these legends. On the contrary, it quietly accepts them. Legend is a safety valve. It keeps the memory of horror from vanishing entirely, but it also prevents it from becoming a clear accusation. When the monstrous man becomes myth, history can breathe easier. He is no longer a specific stain on the page, but a vague story at the edge of memory. Over time, what remains becomes harder and harder to distinguish. The few documents that reference the events are read with skepticism, possibly exaggerated, likely misunderstood. That era was different. Each new layer of interpretation adds another veil over the truth. And the more veils accumulate, the harder it becomes to return to the origin. The most dangerous thing about distorted memory is that it convinces people they understand. They know the story, but a version smoothed, softened, made tellable without discomfort. They know something horrific happened, but no longer feel its concrete weight. Horror becomes abstract, and when horror is abstract, it loses its warning power. In this state, the monstrous man is protected most subtly. No one denies his existence, but no one is forced to confront him as an individual, sustained by power, silence, and compromise. He becomes an old story, a vague lesson rather than a specific reminder of what happens when a society looks away. The gaps in the records are now filled with imagination, and imagination, no matter how dark, is less dangerous than truth. Because imagination does not require people to question the present. It allows them to keep a safe distance, believing such things belong only to a distant past, incapable of repetition. But memory, no matter how distorted, is never fully obedient. Somewhere in mismatched details, in conflicting retellings, in contradictory annotations, the truth continues to surface, not as a complete verdict, but as a persistent doubt. And those doubts become footholds for later generations, no longer bound by immediate fear, who begin digging again. Distorted memory is not an ending. It is an intermediate stage, a stage in which the monstrous man is hidden not through denial, but by turning him into something elusive, ungraspable, and therefore easy to ignore. But history, however slow, always returns to the places it once tried to pass over. And when it does, the question will no longer be what happened, but why did we allow it to remain distorted for so long? History is not always read with the same eyes. There are moments when what was once accepted as truth begins to feel insufficient. The stories are too smooth, the gaps are too neatly arranged, and it is precisely that neatness that invites suspicion. Many generations after the records were sealed, after whispers turned into legends, and legends became something told, out of habit, something shifted, not because new evidence emerged, but because a new way of seeing did. People began rereading what had been written, not to confirm it, but to search for what had been left out. Documents that once seemed harmless began to reveal irregularities, timelines that did not align. Major events were recorded in detail, while disappearances were compressed into vague lines. It was not a lack of information, but information arranged according to a strange logic, the logic of avoidance. The closer these records were examined, the more unsettling the realization became. The archives were not incomplete. They were written with great care, but that care was not meant to protect truth. It was meant to protect an existing order. Words were chosen carefully, so they would never be forced to answer the most important question: who was responsible? Within these records, the monstrous man still appears, but only as a shadow, not clear enough to condemn, not vague enough to deny. A presence designed to exist without becoming dangerous. Reading history in this state is like looking at a painting whose center has been scraped away, leaving only the frame and background intact. Later researchers began to understand that the problem was not missing data, but data that had been instructed how to exist, testimonies stripped from their context. Disturbing details were pushed into footnotes or erased. When the fragments were finally assembled, the picture no longer resembled the official story. And it is here that a cold realization takes shape. The monstrous man was not a historical accident. He was not a strange exception that appeared and vanished. He was the product of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to. A system that knew but chose not to know. A system that heard but decided not to listen. Rereading history does not bring immediate release. It does not create justice. The victims do not return. The losses are not repaired, but it shatters something essential, the illusion that everything had been resolved long ago. When history is reread, questions once considered dangerous become unavoidable. Why did the whispers last for years without leading to action? Why were early disappearances never seriously investigated? Why was the power of one individual enough to transform fear into collective silence? These questions do not target the monstrous man alone. They point to everything that stood around him. Those who benefited from silence. The structures that valued surface stability over anonymous lives. Reading history in this light is not comfortable. It forces the reader to admit that crime does not exist in a vacuum. What makes this stage especially bleak is this: everything is already too late. There is no one left to interrogate, no one left to confront. The monstrous man was buried in records long ago, and those who knew him best have vanished with time. When truth resurfaces, it no longer takes the form of a verdict, but of a bitter awareness. History knew, and history chose a response aligned with its own interests. Rereading cannot change that decision, but it exposes its nature. It reveals that what is called the official version is not always the result of truth prevailing, but often the result of compromise succeeding. At this point, the story is no longer only about the missing children. Though they remain at the heart of the tragedy, it becomes a story about how a society allowed a monstrous individual to exist long enough to cause terror, and then allowed him to fade from collective memory without ever fully answering for it. When history is reread, the darkness does not come from gore or violence. It comes from the realization that what happened was not unimaginable, but once quietly accepted. And if it was accepted once, the possibility of repetition is never zero. This is not the end of the story. This is where the story becomes most dangerous, because from here on, the listener can no longer comfort themselves by saying it was only a legend or a mistake of a distant era. History, when reread, does not speak only about the past. It stares directly into how people choose in the present. Some truths are not buried because they are vague, but because they are too clear. So clear that if fully acknowledged, the entire structure that sustained them would be forced to collapse. At this stage, history no longer debates what happened. The suspicions are dense enough. The contradictions are visible enough. The gaps in the records can no longer be explained as a coincidence. But instead of opening a path toward exposure, history chooses another route. It decides that this truth is not allowed to exist in its entirety, not through denial, but through limitation. The truth is permitted to exist only in fragments. A detail here, an illusion there, a marginal note never assembled into a complete narrative, because a complete narrative would lead to a conclusion. And that conclusion is unacceptable, because if the truth were fully named, it would not only accuse a monstrous individual, it would indict an entire system that saw that heard and that chose silence. It would force questions about power privilege and which lives were deemed expendable without disturbing the broader order. History, by its very function, is not designed to indict itself. And so the truth is held at a level sufficient to explain but never enough to convict. The most critical documents are classified, delayed, or lost in archival processes. Direct terms are replaced with neutral language. Killing becomes death. Intention becomes circumstance. Responsibility becomes historical context. This is not accidental wording. This is a calculation. Within this structure, the monstrous man is held in a state of half-existence. He is neither exonerated nor fully condemned. He becomes an unresolved problem, a file without a final page. And that is precisely what renders him harmless to the present, because a crime without a conclusion gradually loses its power to shock. Time completes the process. Each passing generation adds another layer of interpretation, another layer of hesitation. The sharp questions of the beginning grow softer. Strong words are replaced by phrases like "perhaps according to some sources" cannot be fully verified. The truth is not erased, but worn down until it is no longer sharp enough to cut into collective memory. The most frightening part is this: the process requires no grand conspiracy. It functions through small, reasonable decisions made in the short term. Do not cause instability. Do not reopen the past. Do not damage the reputation of institutions. Each reason seems convincing on its own, but together, they form a wall that keeps truth from reaching the light. On the other side of that wall are the victims, not as individuals, because their names are rarely preserved, but as a collective rendered invisible. Their existence is acknowledged only indirectly, as unfortunate consequences, rather than as lives deliberately taken. This is the price paid to keep truth in a manageable form. The monstrous man, therefore, no longer needs direct protection. He is protected by the very structure of remembrance itself, by how history decides what deserves to be told and what should be passed over. He does not need to be praised nor defended. He only needs to be kept from the center of a complete story. A truth that is not allowed to exist fully is not denied. It is a truth that has been broken apart, weakened, and dispersed until it no longer has the force to hold anyone accountable. And when that happens, the monstrous man achieves a final kind of victory, not in his lifetime, but in how he is remembered. This is the point where the story reaches its final boundary of darkness, because from here on, the issue is no longer what one individual did. It is that a society decided there were truths better left incomplete, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important. A truth not permitted to exist in full becomes a lingering shadow. It does not vanish, it haunts. It lies dormant in unopened files, in unasked questions, in the discomfort felt whenever someone comes too close to the center of the story. And it is this shadow that leads into the final movement, not to deliver justice, but to ask the unavoidable question: what is truly more terrifying, the monstrous individual who committed the crimes, or the system that decided the truth about him, was not allowed to exist in full? After everything that has been written, everything that has been erased, and everything that was never allowed to exist in full, what remains is not a verdict. There is no gavel striking the table, no public declaration, no historical moment rises to admit guilt. There is only silence, a silence stretching across generations, heavy enough to become part of the historical landscape. Documents are stored away, files are sealed, names are annotated and then disappear. All of it creates the artificial sensation that the story is finished, that order has been restored, that everything necessary has been known. But that order is built on absence. Absence where the names of victims should have existed. Absence where responsibility should have been assigned. Absence where truth was bent to fit within the limits of what society could tolerate. And within those absences, the monstrous man continues to exist differently. Not as a convicted figure, but as a deliberate absence. He does not need to be mentioned often. It is enough that whenever someone approaches too close to the center of the story, the records blur, the language grows cautious, and the conversation quietly turns away. This silence is not forgetting. It is an unspoken agreement. An agreement that some things, even if they happened, are better left unexamined. The children who disappeared were never given an ending in official history. There are no collective graves, no complete lists. They survive as shadows in fragmented communal memory, in stories cut short, in a lingering unease passed from one generation to the next without anyone fully remembering its origin. History, in its way of operating, chose to protect itself. It protected the image of order, of power, of continuity. To do so, it accepted the sacrifice of clarity. And in that sacrifice, the monstrous man was granted a particular ending, not public execution, not total erasure, but a suspended existence, enough not to vanish, enough not to threaten. The most terrifying part is not what he did. It is that he did not need to be hidden by a single grand lie, only by countless small silences, countless reasonable decisions, countless choices of not now unnecessary, too complicated. Layer upon layer of silence stacked into a wall that truth could not penetrate, and that wall does not belong to the past. It still stands as a familiar mechanism, a way societies deal with truths that are too heavy to bear, not by confronting them, but by blurring them, dispersing them, until no one is certain what truly happened. When looking back at this story, the final question is not who the monstrous man was or how many children he killed. The numbers, if they ever fully existed, are no longer intact. The details, if they were once recorded, honestly have been altered. The final question is this: why was silence so easily accepted? Why does a society live with the absence without demanding it be filled with truth? Why collective memory could be built on what was never spoken? And why across centuries, monstrous individuals can still slip out of history, not because they were innocent, but because the truth about them was too inconvenient. The story closes here, not with release, but with a chill. The most frightening thing in history is not only those who commit atrocities, but humanity's ability to learn how to live alongside them, as long as they are wrapped tightly enough in silence, and that whenever history chooses not to look directly, darkness does not disappear. It waits.